interest in the West probably began as a young kid growing up in Montana and Minnesota, and undeniably fascination with the Western movies that we used to go watch on Saturday afternoons. And there's that mystical, magical element of the life of the cowboy that just stuck with me. And as a kid, I knew I wanted to be a cowboy. I didn't know I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know I wanted to go to school. I knew I wanted to be a cowboy. And I think that was where it all began, that childhood dream that some of us don't grow out of. You know, I never read Westerns a lot. I used to read horse books a lot. I used to read uh, some of the Tom Sawyer and Mark Twain and things like that. And my mother used to read to us, and she would, for some reason, she was not an educated woman, but she used to read classics to us, the classic novels. And somehow that stuck with me, and there was a real interest, I think, that came from that. And then I did begin to read some Westerns, and ultimately got to the point where um, uh, I started reading stories that were written by authors who had good character development and things like that, but were still set in the West. So I wanted to find cowboy books that had stories of the West and the things that I thought were really fun, but that had another level that went to them that was really appealing to me. So I would think that's probably where it came from, and then ultimately reading guys like Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy was a real groundbreaking kind of an author for me. I read Blood Meridian, and I thought, this guy doesn't even know how to capitalize, he doesn't punctuate, he doesn't do anything right. And I couldn't stop thinking about that book. And after reading Blood Meridian, I thought, I would love to write a book. And driving home from work one day, I thought, well, I'll go ahead and give it a try and see what happens. And found out how much fun it was and how enjoyable that whole experience was, and fell right into it. They Rode Good Horses was the first book, and that was an idea that struck me as I was driving home one night. I thought, what would be a fun thing to write about? What would be interesting? And of course, my reference points were all back to the early West, and there was sort of this juxtaposition of the elements of the early West and how life was back then with the way it is today. And I'm listening to the radio on the way home, and they're talking about all these social services and all the political things that are going on, all the complexities of today's life. And I thought, what if you were coming across on that westward expansion and you lost everything? What would you do as an adult? Where would you turn? There's no telephones, you can't call anybody. What do you do for help? You were on your own. And then that idea then perpetuated itself to the point, well, what would you do if you're 10 years old? What would you do? You're a kid and you're out there and you lose everything, you're by yourself. Well, and then I said, well, first thing, you need a sidekick. So we give him a 15-year-old sidekick to help this kid move along a little bit faster than he normally would, and then you give them each a horse. And so the story built around that, and what it really was, in my mind, was these two kids and how they would represent that whole story of the West in their lives. Because it was a relatively short, compressed time period in which all this took place. And so to see it through the eyes of these two kids, and then to see them in the end of the story as two old men looking back on their lives, and how would all of that affect them? Of course, today they would be in psychoanalysis and all these other things, but in those days they weren't. So that was really how that story came to be, and They Rode Good Horses turned out to be the result of all of that thinking. Things evolve, things change every day. One of the things that's really critically important, I think, is as you do in business, you associate yourself with good people. You associate yourself with like-minded people. You try to find people who are smarter than you to associate with, and in a lot of our cases, that's very easy to do. As a friend of mine said one day, he said, look, he said, you want to find somebody that's smarter than me, throw a rock in any direction, you're going to hit one. And so for me, to see the business the way it's evolving is a challenge for an author, but it's a challenge for publishers, and it's a challenge for retailers and wholesalers and everybody in between. My feeling is that you can either have the old thinking that says you want it to be the way it used to be and then approach it that same way. Probably you'll be destined for failure. I think what you do is you get ahead of the technology, you try to get yourself out in front of what's going on and participate in that. Uh, Whether it's ebooks or some other new format that we haven't even heard of yet. I mean, the audiobooks and all these other kinds of things. I think you try to get as good as you can at understanding that business. But from my point of view, I think the other thing that every author should recognize is the responsibility that he has in his part of trying to make this thing a success. If you think that you're going to write a book, send it off, get rich and famous, and then work on the next one while everybody else is out there working, you're not in tune with today's real world of publishing. So I think it's exciting. I think all of the different mediums, whether it's an ebook or an audiobook or paperback or hardback, is getting more people to read. And that's what we as authors want to do. We want people to read our books. So the format, the delivery system, which is really what it is, it's really sort of immaterial. I think I'm very excited about the future of the business. I think it's going to really encourage more people to read. I hope it does. And I think what there's going to be is there's a shaking out period. There will be authors and publishers who can't adjust to that, and they will get left behind. There will be the other ones who are forward enough thinking to participate in that and realistically participate in the levels that make the most sense. And I think in the final analysis, everybody has to recognize that it is a business, and so it has to be operated like a business. The next book was a function of course, getting that first book out of the way, finally settling back in, and after you've had an opportunity to absorb all the fun parts of the first one and then start to recognize there's a responsibility now with the second one to do better than you did with the first one, but still to remain true, I think, to the integrity of the writing in terms of writing quality material, and still recognizing that what we're really doing is providing a product for a consumer and writing accordingly. So my goal was always to write things that people like to read, that they would think about when they finished reading. And so the theme of the second book was a little bit of a spin-off from the theme of the first book, in that it dealt with sort of a coming of age for a young boy. The name of the book is UNBROKE HORSES, and I'll explain how that came about. But in that second story, what was the concept that was really important to me was to examine was a typical literary theme of good versus evil. And in my thinking, my thought processes as I was thinking about this plot line was, where does evil come from? When you look at a little kid, you've got your son or your daughter, and they're an innocent little kid. There is no way you can imagine them ever becoming anything evil. There are some days when you can never imagine them doing anything other than becoming something evil, but the truth is you can't see that in a kid. I mean, kids are so beautiful, they're so innocent. And so the theme in my mind was, how does that come about, and then how does somebody deal with that? And so the theme of the story, I thought, well, I'm going to start with a kid who's a preacher's son. He has been taught right from wrong. He has values, hopefully, that reflect his background. And in this particular case, the story was represented in, or evil was represented in the story by 3 Civil War deserters. And these 3 degenerate men deserted the war back east, traveled west, kidnapped this boy, and there's a lot of brutality. It is a tough, tough story in terms of the brutality that this kid experienced and the things that he went through after he was kidnapped, and they murdered his parents. And so what he found, the young protagonist in the story, what he discovered was that turning the other cheek didn't work for him. All the things that he had been taught were ineffectual, and his life and well-being were at stake. He had to adapt, and in the process of adapting, learned that violence is, in his case, was the right counter move for him to make for violence that was being perpetrated upon him. And then, of course, that progressed, and he found out that having a weapon, the firepower of that gun, was even more empowering for him. And so he was seduced into evil as a result of his need for finding a method of surviving. And then he found not only did it work, he liked the feeling of finally being in power, because he was so repressed by these guys this whole time that they had him held captive. And then he takes it to the next extreme. He ends up committing violence back the other direction. So the young protagonist in the story, who was the preacher's son and ultimately ended up having all of these evil things perpetrated on him, as he discovered that the only thing that would allow him any power to respond to that was evil itself. And he not only found out that evil would help him in his survival, he ended up embracing it. And then the point of the story then was going to be, how does evil perpetuate itself in the next generation? It has to come from somewhere. So this innocent preacher's son found that the empowerment that he experienced as a result of resorting to the same kind of evil that he was detesting worked for him. And without ruining the part of the plot line of the story, I will tell you that he commits evil at least equal to that was perpetrated upon him. And the remainder of the story, the last third of the story, is how this kid is going to find redemption as a result of all of that. And what he ends up doing, of course, is because of his embracing of evil, he becomes a very damaged young man. And at 14, 15 years old, very impressionable years, very, very difficult time for a kid under normal circumstances. And he has the good fortune of being taken under the protective wing of one of the other characters in the book, who steers him towards a ranch and gets him a job for the summer working on this ranch, hopefully to help rehabilitate his thinking, but at least just to get him out of the that whole environment that he was struggling with before. The young boy meets some young cowboys who try to help him along, doesn't want to participate with them, he almost kills one of them, and ends up in a situation where his life is going from bad to worse, and now it's very obvious that this kid does not even fit in a normal society any longer. And he meets an old Indian horse trainer, and the horse trainer introduces him to a band of wild horses that he's going to work in the round pen and try to break for the use on the ranch. They've got another cowboy on the ranch who breaks horses for the remuda for everyday use, and he breaks them the cowboy way. Gets on, just rides this daylights out of them and breaks those horses. And this kid is talking to the Indian and wants to know, are we going to break these horses? He says, no, we don't break these horses. He says, what we do is we help these horses do what they need to do so they can become good. Kid is asking one of the cowboys, well, what's the difference between the way Riggs, the cowboy, and Noka, the Indian, trains these horses? And he explains to the boy that the horses that Riggs trains work because they have to. The horses that the Indian trains works because they want to. And the horses then, the wild horses, become a symbol of what this kid has become himself. They're unruly, they're reactionary, they're dangerous. Everything about them is what this kid has become. And the kid is resistant. He sort of wants to do it, but he doesn't want to do it. And so there's this pulling and pushing back and forth. Finally, one morning they get in the round pen with the horses, and the Indian's going to explain to the kid what he needs to do. The kid doesn't get it, gets in trouble, and shatters what little confidence that he had. Finally, they rebuild that, and the Indian makes no concessions to the kid. He just shows him what needs to be done, explains to him in really simple terms. And there's a moment in the book which is sort of a pivotal point for this kid, where the Indian is explaining what the problem is between the horses and him and the way the horses react. He said, these horses react the way they do because they're afraid. And it's fear that drives them to become so aggressive and act the way they do. And they need to be dealt with in a different manner. And as this Indian is explaining this to the boy. The boy's listening very intently, looks down at his boots, and he looks back up at the Indian. He said, "We ain't talking about the horses, are we?" And at that moment, then you recognize that the kid sees that everything that he's dealing with and trying to get these horses to do is what he needs to do for himself. So his redemption is going to come, hopefully, in the form of his ability to deal with these horses. So what he learns and accomplishes with the horses are hopefully going to be what happens to him. So the crux of the story is whether or not he's going to be able to successfully redeem himself through that process, or if he's going to end up being the next generation of evil. Well, from my point of view, I mean, I come from a cowboy background, so I've had a lifetime of dealing with horses and cattle and cowboys. One of the things that has become really apparent to me, the difference in that culture, the cowboy culture, is that things are more defined in terms of black and white. I mean, right and wrong, and working cattle, for example, is a great experience. I wish everybody could have an opportunity to do that at least long enough to recognize some things in themselves. I've had a lot of people who want to come out and cowboy. Well, you get up too early in the morning, you're out there when it's too cold, it's too wet, but they'll do it. And one of the things that you understand when you work cattle is that they make no concessions for how good looking you are, how much money you have, how much education you have. They don't care how many people report to you at work or what you think you know. They will run you down, kick you, run you over, and beat you up regardless of where you come from. They are the equal opportunity destroyer. And the great part about that is it's a humbling experience. It makes you recognize how insignificant you really are relative to something of a larger order. And so that's sort of the basis for the whole thing in my mind. And I think that culture is reflected in early Western literature because the guys who used to write that were cowboys. You know, some of those guys came from that background. I mean, Will James, and even talking to Max Evans, these guys lived it. They are that culture. I mean, they represent that whole spirit because that's where they came from. And I think, so what I see in the literature part of this is sort of the same thing, is we've got a cultural issue where there are certain values. And when you go back and you think about cowboys, for example, the West, if you really look at what the cowboy did and where he came from, he was nothing but a common day laborer. He never had any money, never really accomplished much. You know, the shootouts and all those things were sort of a glorified part of it that obviously existed. But somehow, these laborers managed to elevate themselves as an iconic representation of America, not unlike the knights of the medieval times. I mean, literally, the American cowboy is King Arthur's knight, and still, even to this day, that whole aura of values that he represents is very, very strong and comes across like that. And so you have to ask yourself, how did that ever happen? How could somebody from a common job, I mean, and it literally was a low regarded job, elevate himself to that level? Because I think they represented what was really missing from society today, and that's that honesty, integrity, and that whole list of things that we attribute to John Wayne. And John Wayne represented that. And so I think Western literature has sort of taken a direction that, by virtue of the fact that there aren't very many cowboys left, that it's now being written by people who don't have that experience. And because they don't have that experience, they have to go back. And there are some who are really, really good at recapturing the essence of it from reading about it and from understanding it. And for some people, it's a natural part of who they are, and you can see it in the way they write. I mean, they're very, very good because of that. I was talking to Max Evans actually yesterday about that, and he said, yeah, that's part of the problem. There's just not enough cowboys writing anymore. So in order to capture that whole thing that represents the cowboy culture and the value system, it takes a really sensitive writer to go back and understand that, and to change some of the things that happens in these books to come from the point of the value and not the glory of the shootout and the galloping across the prairie and all those things, because those were just, that's the backdrop. That's sort of the canvas upon which all this is painted. And so going forward, I think what Western literature is starting to do is it's starting to represent culture as it is today. You know, there are more and more stories about cowboys and aliens because that's where the mindset is today. So I think in some sense there's a little bit of a nostalgic, at least on my part, a nostalgic representation of the fact that I think as we see this cowboy culture starting to disappear, I think we're starting to see the John Wayne kinds of values disappear with it to some extent. But I think there are enough people who are writing really good Westerns now, who've never been on a horse, that will carry it forward. It's just going to be a smaller part of the culture.